Hello and welcome to another episode of Katie the Science Lady. I'm Mrs. Jacobson and today's topic is binomial nomenclature. So let's learn together. All right, here we go. Let's talk about binomial nomenclature. Remember, this as itself, the prefix bi or bi means two. Nome here, N-O-M, means name. So it's a little redundant because we're talking about the two-name naming system. So it sounds kind of like a lot, but that's really what binomial nomenclature means, is two-name naming system. It's our classification system, and we use two names to identify an organism. We talked about this briefly in my last video about taxonomy, but we're going over it again in a little bit more detail. So if you take a look at this frog here, I want you to think about what it might be called, just where it's from. Maybe gigantic frog. I thought like Goliath frog would make sense because it looks really big. Even maybe like red leg frog because it's got kind of pink on its legs. But that's the kind of common name that we would expect this to be called. This frog does have lots of different common names, and I'm going to show you a couple of them now. It's known as the Middle American white-lipped frog, which, his lips don't look that white to me, but what do I know? The giant ditch frog, that makes sense to me. It's giant. I get that. It's also known as the crapaud, which seems a little silly in French, but I have no idea what that means. And there's another name that makes no sense at all to me. It's also called the mountain chicken. As crazy as that sounds, it is one of the most common names for this frog. If I asked you to close your eyes and picture a mountain chicken, I know for a fact that that is not it. I ask my students to do this every year in class. I ask them to draw me a mountain chicken, and I get a chicken on top of a mountain, predictably. It makes sense. Not a single student has ever drawn me a frog, ever. So it can be kind of confusing to try and figure out what organism we're talking about when we have this many common names, especially these many common names that are so different from each other. The actual scientific name of this frog is Leptodactylus phalanx. Leptodactylus phalanx. Dactyl has to do with toes, and lepto usually has to do with spotting. So it has to do with the fact that it's got spots on its toes, which makes a little more sense to me. This is in Latin, as all scientific names are, and it's got binomial nomenclature. One name, two names, so that's the binomial part, and it's telling us about that organism. Let's learn a little bit more about why this came to be and how it helps us. We have a couple of rules for binomial nomenclature. We have to have it in italics. You'll notice here that the writing I have is slightly slanted. You can only use italics on a computer or typewriter type thing, something where you're not physically handwriting it. You cannot write in italics. It doesn't work. If you're handwriting it, you need to underline. So that's the only kind of really big key here is that, remember, this is not italicized. My title is not italicized up here, but this is italicized where it's kind of written slanted. The first name is capitalized. Here, the Leptodactylus, lepto, that part, is capitalized. The second name is going to be lowercase. Now, this may seem a little strange to you. For example, most of us have two names. Some of us have more than two names. Some of us, if we're share, only have one name. But we capitalize both of our names, our first and our last name. That's traditional. However, with our binomial nomenclature, our scientific naming, we only capitalize that first name. We don't capitalize the second name. And that's just a rule for our naming system. Our first name can be shortened here. So instead of Leptodactylus phalanx, which can be kind of a long, mouthy thing to say, you can shorten it to L phalanx, which is totally fine. In most cases, it is specific enough to tell you the specific animal. Sometimes the first letter isn't quite enough. It's very rare that that happens, but you may have to add a letter. But typically shortening it like this is completely fine. Again, note that this has been italicized. If it weren't italicized, it would have to be underlined. So why do we do this? What's the point? Why can't we just all decide on a common name? Why can't we all just call it a mountain chicken? It's kind of funny. I kind of like it. It makes me laugh. But why can't we do that? So for the basic thing, we need to have a standard method. We can't just have everybody on the planet vote on a common name for these organisms. It doesn't work that way. There's different countries. We have different ideas of what it might mean. We have different languages. It would be a mess. we would have no idea what we were talking about at any given time. It prevents confusion that comes from those common names. If you tell somebody in Japan, for example, that you're looking at a mountain chicken, they will have no idea what you're talking about. They probably won't even know it's a frog. They'll be picturing something completely different than what you are. And that's important if you're trying to communicate, even if just different places in the country, even just different places in the state, it's known as different things. So it could be very confusing if you're talking about a mountain chicken or if you're talking about one of its other many common names. The biggest reason we use scientific naming, and the most important one, is it allows scientists to discuss in one language. Scientists all over the world can discuss the exact same species in Latin. So because they're using the same language, it allows us all to understand it. We're not all using English, we're not all using Spanish, we're not all using Italian, we're using one language, which is kind of nice because it's a little bit of like neutral ground. When we look at our scientific naming, we have down here this species, that's a puppy, and Canis lupus familiaris is the scientific name for a domesticated dog. Notice here, that first name is capitalized, the second name is lowercase. Familiaris just means that it's been domesticated, and that's kind of, you could throw that on the end of a couple of different species. It's underlined because I did not italicize it here, and those are just the basics of our naming system, uppercase, lowercase, underline, or italics. It's pretty common. Canis is the genus name. You can see over here it includes foxes, or that actually is wolves, I'm sorry. My eyes are not great. So it's a wolf, and we also have dogs. So this should make sense to us if the genus, it's closely related, because we know wolves and dogs are very closely related. Some dogs look like wolves. So that should also kind of help us connect in our head. Genus is a very closely related group of organisms. Now, familiaris is our species name. So Canis and then lupus is kind of referring to wolf. And our species name is just that domesticated version, and it's our dogs. Genus, it consists of a group of closely related species. So over here we have that genus. We see wolves of different kinds. There are dingoes here. There are coyotes. So these are different types of wolves and other dog-like creatures that are very closely related. Notice that dogs are not included in this group. So I know these kind of look like dogs, but they're not. These are all wild. They are not domesticated. So they would not be in the species familiaris because they're just not that domesticated dog. These are all wild animals. These are the other animals in the Canis group. And you can see they have lots of different types of locations. They live in different environments. They can live all over the world, but they are still closely related to each other. The genus name is always capitalized, just to keep that in mind. And now I want to talk about species. I know I kind of moved past genus quickly. Species is kind of a tricky subject, and you'll notice I have this disclaimer down here. So as we go through it, keep this in mind. A species consists of animals that can mate and produce fertile offspring. Let me explain. So if two animals or organisms will mate with each other, have a baby, and that baby can have babies itself, then they are the same species. So just because two animals can mate and produce offspring or a baby doesn't mean they're in the same species. There are some like babies that are born of that are not able to have their own babies. And I'll explain that a little bit more. So again, they mate and they can produce fertile offspring. Fertile means they're able to have babies, just to clarify that. So our species name is always lowercase. And I want to give you an example of a time where there are two different species and they cannot produce fertile offspring. So if we look here, we have a horse and we have a donkey. A lot of times humans will put them in the same area and they will mate. So it's not that they won't mate, but they need to be in close proximity. So a horse and a donkey, if you have them mate, they will produce a mule. Now, you can see down here we've got some N numbers and things like that. These are the chromosome numbers. The reason that species are separated is because they have different numbers of chromosomes a lot of the time. If you have a baby with an odd number of chromosomes, many times they cannot reproduce. Again, the majority of the time they cannot reproduce. So let's say the horse was 64, this donkey had 62 chromosomes. When you, again, add them together and divide, you get 63 chromosomes. So the mule has 63, and it can't kind of split that evenly anymore, so it will not have fertile offspring. This is the traditional definition of a species. There have been some recent exceptions over the years of kind of mutations, some odd things happening where a mule may be able to reproduce, or where a liger, which is the product of a tiger and a lion, where a liger could reproduce. So this is not 100% accurate anymore, but this is the accepted definition. It is true the majority of the time. This is our definition for a.
All right, so let's review our biological system of naming, also known as binomial nomenclature. The bi part of that name, bi, is representative of the two names. So each biological organism has two names scientifically. The first is going to be the genus, and the second is the species name. So it's kind of our last two levels of organization there, our last two taxas, genus and species, to make sure that we're specifically talking about one organism and not a family, not a group, not anything else like that. The genus is always capitalized. The second name, the species, is always lowercase. This may seem a little strange to some of us. Why would they both be uppercase? But it's because it allows us to determine the difference between a genus and a species name. So genus capitalized, species lowercase. Additionally, that name is either always italicized, you have to be on a computer to do that, or underlined. So if you're free writing something down, you can go ahead and underline it. And the big reason that we use this system for naming is because a single organism can have multiple common names out in the public. So if scientists are talking to each other, they have to make sure they're talking about the exact same organism, not just an organism common to their area of the world. So they do this by using that binomial nomenclature name, that was a little redundant, but the one that's in Latin. So that language is going to allow them to talk about the exact same organism no matter where they come from in the world and no matter what other common names that organism might have. All right, that's it for us today. Please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more biology videos. I'll be keeping them coming out all year. And as always, I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you later.